Hi, I am here. So are some of you. Very good. I haven't had much chance to share to my pages, the new macro media page and the Center for the Public Purpose page. So if you can do that, I greatly appreciate it. If you can share to groups, I greatly appreciate that as well, because I just had a technical problem from Facebook in sharing. I don't know why, but it wasn't taking the shares. So maybe it'll take the shares from some of you, even if it's not really taking shares. But from me, I don't think I'm in Facebook jail, okay, or anything like that. But I just think it's being balky for some reason. So anyway, hello Dolores, how are you? Hi Carmen. Hi Kay. Great to see you too. Kay says, listening to a movement for a People's Party too. Okay. And Kay has shared. Thank you, Kay. So please share to groups, especially having a bit of a problem doing that here tonight as well. Well, I'm going to get right started tonight because, of course, today has been full of reactions and responses to the riots that we had just yesterday, that some people, including myself, were calling, an insurrection. However pitiful, an insurrection it may have been. So, let's get to some of the reactions and some of the responses, and then let's get to analysis and causes, of various kinds, and see how all those connect up in various ways, and see what the impact, of all this is. I have to warn you, though, the response here is going to be highly multidimensional. It's not a simple thing to do. because we're in a very complicated, or I should say complex situation now. I use that word, advisedly, because we're in the realm of complex adaptive systems theory here. I don't want to get too abstract, so I'm not going to go into that aspect of it too much. But the difference when it comes to complicated and complex is when it's complicated, one can deal with it essentially piece by piece by breaking it down and putting it back together. But when you're dealing with a complex system, the sum of the parts is not equal to the whole. So that is very, very different. And that's what we have in social systems. We have complex adaptive systems. So here we are. I suddenly must have scared people off because 4 people suddenly disappeared. I don't know why. But anyway, let me get to the first of the pieces I want to pick up for tonight. The first one is from the Fiscal Times, not normally a place where one would find this kind of thing, but let me share it. Okay, at this point, and the article is by Yuval Rosenberg, I believe. Is it not right? Yeah, it's by Yuval. On January 6, 2021, he's one of the main staff writers, if not the main staff writer at the Fiscal Times. Fiscal Times is the rag that was started with money from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, and it is usually devoted to various aspects of austerity in federal budgeting. And I follow it just to see what they're up to and how they're developing their doctrinal ideology. Anyway, I thought it interesting to look at how they responded. They say, how do we respond to the Trump insurrection? They actually ask the question. There's a picture of the Capitol with tear gas all around it and mobs kind of in the front. Almost looks like a scene from The Lord of the Rings with people besieging a castle, all massed on the stairways, I wonder if those folks down there are the orcs. Anyway, today, January 6, 2021, is a date which will live in infamy, to borrow President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's words after Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941. I'm surprised to find that FDR is quoted at the Fiscal Times. But anyway, only today's horrifying attack on American democracy wasn't by a foreign force, came from a treasonous mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol, forcing the building into lockdown. A treasonous mob, mind you, waving the American flag, as Congress was meeting to formally certify President-elect Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election. At this hour, our democracy is under an unprecedented assault, unlike anything we've seen in modern times, Biden said on Wednesday afternoon. The Capitol breach came just hours after the sitting president, Donald Trump, egged on the crowd at a rally, continuing his baseless claims of widespread election fraud, telling his supporters, quote, "We will never give up. We will never concede," unquote. Oh, and by the way, today, when he got back his Twitter account, it seems his first tweet was his concession. So, but anyway, quote, "This is what the president has caused today, this insurrection," an angry Senator Mitt Romney said. In the video tape message later in the day, Trump urged his supporters to go home, but continued to deny reality and inflame those supporters by claiming that the election was stolen from him and from then Quote, "We love you, you're very special," unquote, he added. Right? Similar to Hitler, it's about the stab in the back. It was stolen from us. It's the stab in the back. We at the Fiscal Times, it's not for nothing that Mein Kampf was on Trump's desk for years. We at the Fiscal Times generally look to, quote, "stay in our lane," unquote, to focus our coverage on the policy issues that are vital to America's future. We're all set to tell you about the implications of Democrats' victories in Georgia's Senate runoff races, and we will. But that future depends on the health of our democracy, and the heartbreaking and undemocratic events of the day demand that demand that demand that all Americans, including Trump and his most ardent supporters, heed FDR's exhortation from nearly 70 years ago in responding to the attack. We must all, quote, "make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us," unquote. To be clear, unlike FDR's speech, this is not a call to arms. It is not a declaration of war, but it is an appeal to all Americans to recognize the danger of Wednesday's insurrection, call out the forces that led to the mob attack on the Capitol, stand up for facts over fantasy, and trite as it may sound, civility instead of civil war. Quote, "The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are," Biden said to the nation Wednesday afternoon. Quote, "Like so many other Americans, I am genuinely shocked and saddened that our nation, so long a beacon of light and hope for democracy, has come to such a dark moment," unquote. Trump's enablers in Congress may not have expected their election challenges and fealty to Trump and his base would lead to such a moment, and were not actively seeking this outcome. Quote, "What is the downside for humoring him for this little bit of time? No one really seriously thinks the results will change," unquote. One senior Republican official told the Washington Post way back in November. It's not like he's plotting how to prevent Joe Biden from taking power on January 20th. He's tweeting about filing some lawsuits. Those lawsuits will fail. Then he'll tweet some more about how the election was stolen, and then he'll leave, unquote. We know now how short-sighted and foolhardy that approach was. Trump isn't backing away from his inflammatory election claims, but his enablers must now realize they've been playing with fire or flirting with sedition. Maybe this is the shock about those enablers, and we as a nation need to back away from the dangerous path Trump has set. And there is various pictures of the path that Trump has set. And that's the end. That's the end. No recommendations about what to do. Just basically a condemnation of the action. And nothing about what actions the rest of us should take except to step back. Except to step back. Is the position of this paper compromised in some way? Okay, or not? Is the whole recommendation that it's for the enablers and we as a nation simply to back away? Is that all there is to it? Well, others were a little more activist in their approach. For example, Dave Dayen had this to say. In a piece in the Prospect today entitled What It Means to Never Forget, okay, by David Dayen, January 6th, 2021. Another photo, okay, another angle of people pointing guns at some other people. That's the Capitol Police. Guns drawn, stand near a barricaded door as supporters of Donald Trump, President Trump, tried to break into the House chamber at the Capitol, January 6, 2021. In 1982, the economy was sick. Consequence of Paul Volcker's death dance with inflation. Unemployment was at double-digit levels, a place it would not reach again for more than 25 years. And whenever, by Ronald Reagan, who had been president for a couple of years to that point, was asked about this, he would blame Jimmy Carter. In successive State of the Union speeches in 1982 and 83, he said that the economic damage, which during the campaign he called the Carter Depression, was worse than expected and devilishly difficult to get out from under. He blamed Carter for everything he was challenged on pretty much throughout his presidency. And the conservative movement took the hint, heaping on the scorn. After years of this, Carter was moderate at best, was synonymous with liberal profligacy, and proof positive of the failure of those ideas. And Carter was in no way, of course, an economic liberal. We know that. He was the first one who started spouting fiscal responsibility and the need to balance the budget for some time. There hadn't been a balanced budget president. Well, actually, Johnson was the last one to balance the budget, but he didn't really preach about it. The last one to preach about it was actually Eisenhower. Anyway, the famed 1988 Saturday Night Live debate sketch between George Bush and Michael Dukakis featured Bush asking the audience, quote, "Do we want to go back to the malaise days of Jimmy Carter?" Unquote. It was a laugh line, says Dave, because it had been repeated so often by conservatives over the previous 8 years. Jimmy Carter supporters, or the few that were left by January 6th of 1981, did not invade the Capitol building in an attempted coup to stop electoral vote counting. They didn't wave the Confederate flag in the Capitol, even though Jimmy Carter was from Georgia. Donald Trump is from New York, and his supporters waved the Confederate flag in the Capitol. 155 years after defeat, at Appomattox. They didn't push the government into a lockdown. They didn't vandalize offices. And they didn't shout, quote, "Next time we come back, we're going to be armed," unquote. I watched that yesterday. I had the distinct feeling some of them were armed. They seemed to be armed with sticks. They seemed to be armed with clubs. Some of them were shooting what looked like it was tear gas and pepper spray back at the cops who were pepper spraying them. I think there were a good many of them who were armed. And pipe bombs were left at certain places where they were, like the RNC, for example, had itself a pipe bomb. Anyway, this was Insurrection Day. And the Republican Party is now an insurrection party. And like Reagan did with Carter, that should be the first, last, and only thing that Democrats say about the insurrectionists until their last day in office. and their last day on earth. Anyone who runs under the banner of the insurrection party is associating themselves favorably with treason. January 6th, 2021 must be remembered and acted upon, or it will be the beginning rather than the end of this chapter in history. Now remember the old chant, remember, remember the 5th of November. Dave is saying, remember, remember the 6th of January. What does it mean to never forget? It starts by using the copious amounts of film and photography from this event as physical evidence in a sedition investigation. In many cases, we know the names of the plotters, and we know their faces. The incoming Attorney General, bizarrely and incongruously enough, name is Merrick Garland, the formerly rejected Supreme Court appointee, Obama, the one rejected by Mitch McConnell's Senate. Maybe Garland is going to get his revenge now. Needs to conduct this investigation seriously and relentlessly. The Capitol Police may have escorted the seditionists out of the Capitol today, but every single one of them should be tracked down and brought to justice. If you don't, they will return. It's not like we haven't been warned. Yes, I agree. We've been warned. Next time, they'll be armed. It also means that the Republican Party is tarred with the legacy of Donald Trump forever. In random committee hearings on transit spending, in stump speeches for school board races, in every public utterance where a Democrat has occasion to talk about a Republican, their tolerance of violent overthrow of the U.S. government should be discussed in full-throated fashion. Josh Hawley's political career should be over. Ted Cruz's political career should be over. Everyone who humored, abided by, accepted, and backed up Donald Trump should be called exactly what they are, traitors. Donald Trump should obviously be impeached, removed from office, and barred from ever taking office again, preferably within the next 48 hours. Any member of Congress who supports his effort to overturn a popularly elected president should join him out of office. The mechanism for ridding ourselves of insurrectionists was placed in the Constitution during the last traitorous uprising, and it ought to be used. Furthermore, anyone running for anything at all under the Republican banner should be asked to explain their support of the coup of 2021. Those Republicans who have denounced this effort, and there have been quite a few, have a sure choice to make. They can leave the Republican Party if they don't like being associated with treason. That's the only single way that they can escape the reckoning. Maybe they can join with the Democratic Party, and as the progressives leave to form their own, we can have a two-party system based on policy differences rather than eliminationism. That's an interesting suggestion, isn't it? I'd like to see that happen. After all, the Democratic Party is now a corporate party. So why should the Republicans, who don't want to be a party, who don't want to be associated with the treason party, with an insurrection party, why shouldn't they just join with the other Democratic corporatists? Then we can have a true left party, perhaps the People's Party, perhaps the Green Party, and have the debates we need to have to solve the problems of our country. This had been brewing long before Donald Trump. The last insurrection of 2000 was successful as vote counters in Miami stood down, and the Supreme Court finished the inside job. Prior to that, the same cabal impeached a Democratic president over infidelity. Shortly thereafter, a small but loud faction tried to claim that the nation's first black president was unable to serve because he was a foreigner. That faction then took over the party and led the charge today. The overwhelming evidence is that Republicans, not quote conservatives, unquote, not quote extremists, unquote, but the Republican insurrection party believe that it's illegal for a Democrat to win the presidency. Dave then says, I descend from ancestors who suffered the consequences for tolerance of fascism. To allow the Republican Party to sneak away from their actions would put this country and this democracy at similar risk. Donald Trump is a narcissist and an idiot, but explaining the way of actions of his followers as hapless would be a grave mistake. Chuck Schumer stood on a regained Senate floor on Wednesday night and called those who stormed the Capitol domestic terrorists. That's a start, but he should extend the statement. So the Republicans are domestic terrorists, and that should never, ever be forgotten. If the Republicans are allowed to get through this just by excising, quote, a few bad apples, unquote, if we are told that we should, quote, look forward, unquote, this won't end. The traitors and seditionists will return and will have to answer to future generations why we allowed it to happen. So this, by David, is a call for accountability, an unmistakable call for accountability and for punishment for the collaborators of Donald Trump in the Republican Party, for those who did not fully collaborate with him, but still stayed in the Republican Party, and of course, for Donald Trump himself. David is calling for accountability, swift impeachment, and a bar from public life, and prosecutions to follow. So accountability for Donald Trump, accountability for the rioters. Now I should say and comment here, I'm not at all sure that, first of all of the people gathered outside of the Capitol and trying to get in were actually intending to be part of a riot, or saw themselves, as part of a riot. They may simply have seen themselves as people who were protesters. But there were many of them who were rioters, consciously rioters, who were trying to break in, who were trying to create disorder in the Capitol. Some probably wanted even to hurt people um, who were there. Some people probably who thought it as the opening phase of a revolt against the government of the United States as it now is constituted. Certainly an insurrection against the Congress as it now is constituted. Certainly Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, by their actions over a long time, were calling for an insurrection against the order of doing things inside the Congress. Certainly Donald Trump, in inciting the crowd to march to the Congress and then to be strong, okay, and not to be weak. Certainly he was inciting a riot and certainly intending an insurrection against the activities of the Congress. That is, the formal steps that they were taking in order to certify the result of the election for Joe Biden. Let's quickly move to an article I found in LA Progressive by Bill Blum. This is a very good piece, also very short, fairly short anyway. So as we go through it, okay, this is a new piece either. It's called "The Second Impeachment is Not Only Possible, but it is necessary." And a cartoon with Richard Nixon there. "You really got to dial it back, boy," says Nixon to DJT in this cartoon. There's DJT in his slippers and bathrobe. And the article starts, "Now that Trump has gone full of Lukashenko in his now violent plot to retain power, we have to ask whether this time, finally, the nation will muster the collective will to hold him responsible for his malfeasance. The future of American democracy may depend, I would say will depend, on how the question is answered." Even before Trump's supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th to disrupt the joint session of Congress that had convened to certify Joe Biden's Electoral College victory, Trump had committed a variety of fresh federal and state criminal offenses in his hour-long telephone conversation with Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger on January 2nd. In the call, the sitting president of the United States pressured the Secretary of State and Ryan Germany, the Secretary's General Counsel, to find him enough votes to overturn Biden's win in the state. As two recounts and a signature audit have confirmed, Trump lost Georgia by precisely 11,779 ballots. Nonetheless, Trump made it clear toward the latter part of his talk with Raffensperger that he wasn't just asking for an outlandish favor. Rather, he was making a demand and serving notice in his official capacity that both Raffensperger and Ryan could face federal prosecution if they refused to comply. Don't accept this interpretation of the conversation from me. Take it from Trump himself. Trump has acknowledged on his Twitter account that he made the call, and the Washington Post, which broke the story, has published a complete transcript of the conversation in which Trump was joined by White House uh, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, and several attorneys, including prominent conservative attorney Cleta Mitchell. The Washington Post has also released a complete audio recording of the conversation. You can listen to Trump's own words. Quote, "That's a criminal offense," unquote, he can be heard saying. Okay, and he accused the Secretary of State of reporting false election results. Quote, "And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. And you cannot let it happen. You are letting it happen. I'm notifying you that you're letting it happen. So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have because we won the state," unquote. Realizing the need for action, two Democratic senators of the House of Representatives, Ted Lieu of California, Kathleen Rice of New York, have written FBI Director Christopher Wray asking for a criminal investigation into Trump's threats. Citing two federal statutes and a Georgia law, Lieu and Rice wrote that they believe Trump has engaged in solicitation of or conspiracy to commit a number of federal and state election crimes. Lieu and Rice might also have added treason and sedition to the list, but they drafted their letter before Trump's supporters came to the Capitol and rioted. Unfortunately, there is still little chance that Trump actually will be prosecuted for the phone call, but federally, as the inauguration of Joe Biden approaches, Trump can be preemptively pardoned for any crimes, either by resigning and permitting Mike Pence as his successor for the few days that still remain in the lame duck period to do the honors by issuing a pardon to himself, And as for Georgia, no one should expect an indictment as long as the levers of state government remain in Republican hands. There's another way to hold Trump accountable, however, by means of a second impeachment. The goal of a second impeachment would not be to remove Trump from the White House, unless, of course, he somehow manages to pull off a coup d'etat before January 20th. The goal would be to disqualify Trump from ever holding office again. Under Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, judgment in cases of impeachment extends to both sanctions, removal from current office and disqualification from holding future office. Since Trump reportedly has floated the idea of running for president again in 2024, the second impeachment would be designed to deal a death blow to another Trump campaign with hearings in the House and a trial in the Senate focused on the high crimes and misdemeanors, the phrase used in Article 2 of the Constitution to define impeachable offenses, along with treason and bribery, that Trump committed in his first term in office. Impeachable offenses, moreover, are not subject to the pardon power. A second set of impeachment articles returned against Trump could allege a bundle of serious crimes, in addition to the phone call to Raffensperger, ranging from obstruction of justice in connection with former special counsel Mueller's probe into Russian interference in the 2016 election, to conspiracy to defraud the United States by subverting the entire 2020 election. Well, I certainly agree with the second of these, but as to the first of these, it's Russiagate again. We still have no evidence that there was any Russiagate, no public evidence. Evidently, Bill Blum still happens to believe in that, but that's far from necessary for the impeachment of Donald Trump. What he's done in the last few days is more than enough to impeach him. Nor would the fact that Trump was no longer president legally bar a second impeachment. 1876, the Senate conducted an impeachment trial of Secretary of War William That William Belknap, even though he had resigned before the House voted to impeach him for financial corruption. Although the Senate failed to muster the two-thirds majority needed to convict Belknap, a majority of senators found him guilty. His impeachment trial lasted nearly 4 months and featured more than 40 witnesses. When Richard Nixon escaped impeachment via resignation, the current House and Senate would not be bound by Nixon's example. Both chambers would be free instead to follow the Belknap precedent in the case of impeaching a former president, as several leading constitutional scholars indicated in interviews with the Washington Post in 2019. If he were faced with a second impeachment, Trump wouldn't get off as easily as he did the first time around. He would still have to be convicted of an impeachable offense by a two-thirds Senate majority, but as Amherst College professor Austin Surratt argued in the USA Today column published January 4th, only a simple majority would be needed for disqualification. The National Review has also called for a second impeachment. The bottom line is that Donald John Trump, a 45th commander-in-chief, must be brought to justice by any legitimate means, with the House in Democratic hands, and with enough Republicans in the Senate fed up with Trump's sedition. The second impeachment is not only possible, but it is a necessity. And of course, I entirely agree with that and almost all of the reasoning, of Bill Blum here. The only comment I really had when it comes to disagreement is for Bill Blum to stay far away from the Russiagate thing. We've heard about it for years and years and years, and it has zero credibility, at this point. And the only way you could get any credibility for it was to make public the evidence, if the government has any, of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Further, moving along to another reaction, that's the second one for accountability that we've seen, for Trump accountability. Third one is from Truthout, and it's about a snap impeachment. Should be done within 24 hours, and the article is written by William Rivers Pitt today, or yesterday, no, today. Published today. You should be seeing it now. Yes, I think you are. The President of the U.S. incited a mob attack in Washington, D.C. yesterday. The Capitol Police failed or deliberately refused to defend the Capitol building, and the Republican Party this morning is deservedly in chaos. Just another Wednesday in the sad clown paradise. Donald Trump is in the Bible, one of the mostly maskless records, said to the Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg as the mob swarmed toward the dome. Quote, "Get yourself ready," unquote. Thus spake QAnon, another virus that has staggered the nation in the grim twilight of the worst presidential administration in recorded history. It is thoroughly fitting that Donald Trump's attempted coup was undertaken by people who believe pedophile, lizard, cannibals have taken over the federal government. Nothing less would meet the whipsaw violence of the moment. I was alive to see a U.S. military servicemen push the Huey helicopters off an aircraft carrier to make room for those in full flight from our final debacle in Vietnam. I was in Mrs. King's English class when the Challenger exploded. I was preparing to teach a class when the towers exploded. Less than 2 years earlier, I was in my basement apartment in Boston when the Bush v. Gore decision teed up the ball for every subsequent horror. And I was flat on my back in Cambridge when Baghdad was turned into a cauldron of fire during, quote, shock and awe, unquote. Today, I add January 6, 2021 to the long haul of bleak murals that have decorated my passage through this lethally erratic thing called the future. We were supposed to have flying cars by now. Instead, we have this. There is no point in recapitulating the details of yesterday's attempted sequel to the Beer Paul Putsch. So that was the putsch that was committed by the Nazis in the early 20s, by Hitler. By now, even bathy pelagic fish in the eternal darkness of the ocean deep know what went down in the district yesterday. That was a very imaginative sentence, wasn't it? The bathy pelagic fish in the eternal darkness of the ocean deep. Too much. The facts are stark enough as to be axiomatic. Trump ordered his own private army, quote, I'll be with you, unquote. He lied from the podium with his bare face hanging out, to storm the halls of Congress and disrupt the certification of Joe Biden's victory and the rule of law itself. They succeeded in defiling the building and utterly failed to thwart the certification. The fate of the rule of law remains to be seen. In lieu of telling you what you already know, please allow me to damn Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, and also Mark Meadows, Lindsey Graham, Josh Hawley, Chuck Grassley, Rudy Giuliani, Mick Mulvaney, Rob Portman. Tommy, quote, came down with the last drop of rain and disgraced himself already. Tuberville, Kelly Loeffler, David Perdue, Fox News, Newsmax, Breitbart, OAN, and everyone else who spent years enabling this pocket Nazi of a president for profit, power, and attention, or spent that span standing mute to whatever space happens to be lurking beneath hell. That goes for every still employed staffer in the building. The avalanche has begun. It is too late for the pebbles to plead ignorance. Donald Trump is not a car accident. He is white supremacy's legacy, the product of more than 4 decades of pure, unrefined Republican ideology, and the inevitable shrinking offspring of the Reagan, quote, revolution, unquote, that made racism and plunder wrapped in the flag the core ethos of that party's purpose on this planet. 40 years on, a parade of deliberate GOP actions have created a masterpiece of callous, heavily armed chaos. Even today, close to half of Republican voters believe yesterday's abomination was hot shit. That number pretty closely correlates with the number of people who voted for 4 more years of this in November. being a so-called, quote, never Trumper, unquote, by Republican, is no shelter, Steve Schmidt and friends. You gave us Sarah Palin, okay, among other things, who, along with multiple right-wing luminaries, has spent the day attempting to blame this debacle on Antifa. Imagine blaming it on Antifa. I've passed the last 20 virtually sleepless hours watching a parade of solemnly self-righteous Republicans condemn Trump after allowing this blister to swell until it burst and sprayed hot, stinking pus all over this nominally democratic republic. I have no patience for any of them. The Republican Party should be burned down to the stumps and the earth where it stood, salted, so that nothing so brazenly wretched ever grows there again. If you call yourself a Republican today, shame on you. I have many questions for the Capitol Police, who posed for selfies with the brigands and removed barriers to provide them unencumbered access to the building. And among the many acidic effects of, quote, President Trump, unquote, has been the permission for law enforcement to flex their Ku Klux Klan roots in broad daylight. And yesterday was a pluperfect example. Scant months ago, Black Lives Matter protesters were greeted with the full, bristling, violent menace of the most policed city in the land. Yesterday, far-right mutineers were for the most part allowed to do their thing. If heads do not roll, the whole department should be shoved into the Potomac and let out to sea. Quote, all the senators and congressional people hiding behind their desks now know how it feels to be a public school student in the U.S. One friend said just yesterday, law enforcement through intent, through negligence, or both, allowed that to happen in the supposed seat of what's left of this democracy. Peace is the presence of justice everywhere. When there is no justice, there shall be no peace. But mention that to the next cop you meet. As for the author of this overtopping nightmare, what to say that has not yet been said? Donald Trump must be removed from office with all dispatch, an opinion that is now du jour across most of the real-world media spectrum. Before he can do more damage, he must go. The 25th Amendment has been bandied about as a possible cure, and certainly looks more likely now than it did a few days ago, but it is a long and difficult option to make use of it. The vice president and a majority of the cabinet must tell Congress the president is unable to perform the duties of his office. The president can challenge this with a simple "I'm fine" letter to Congress and immediately retain his powers. If the vice president and the cabinet reaffirm their claim of presidential capacity, the matter goes to Congress for what amounts to a trial for removal. Both the House and the Senate have to agree with the vice president and the cabinet by a 2/3 majority in each chamber. Otherwise, the president stays put, and we do not have that kind of time. Last night, both houses of Congress were assembled. So, what Pitt is telling us here is that the shorter of the two procedures for getting rid of Mr. Trump at this point, the quicker of the two procedures would actually be impeachment rather than the 25th Amendment. Last night, both houses of Congress were assembled for the business of certifying Biden's nascent presidency, they must be called into emergency session. For the moment, few of them are in a mood to defend the man who has misled us to the brink of ruin. This includes much of the GOP. In this moment, by Republicans, shamelessness is a valuable commodity because they can be counted on to turn on their master like the opportunistically rabid dogs they are. In short, all of them are in town, and they should be put to work. A snap impeachment could be done in a day and should be done within literal hours. Okay, Representative Ilhan Omar and a number of her colleagues are drafting and circulating articles at this moment. And Cori Bush, by the way, is circulating um, actually a resolution for the collaborators of Trump in the Senate and in the House, okay, to resign, okay, and to leave the Congress or to be expelled, essentially to be expelled for sedition, okay, against the United States. That's is going to be Cori Bush's the first official act, okay, in Congress. Okay, and AOC, okay, has called on the Republican senators who collaborated to resign and to leave the Senate immediately. But Josh Hawley and people who backed him, I think there are some 10 senators involved, or even 12 senators involved. I think it's 12 actually, because I couldn't help but noting that if they were to resign, there would be a majority of Democrats in the Senate until appointments were made, and they would have a majority then of 50 to 38, at least for the beginning of Biden's years in the presidency. The prospects of yesterday's astonishment being used by Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act in an attempt to prolong his tenure has its face pressed against the window, and all the doors are still unlocked. Make it stop, says Pitt. And those are his final words. So, then we have an article that appeared just previously to that. It appeared actually before the riots, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's by Jack Rasmus. It appeared at LA Progressive. That's where I picked it up. What happens January 6th, 20th, okay, and after? And of course, Jack did not expect what we saw on January 6th. Here's a cartoon of Trump saying, "Find me 11,780 votes to Raffensperger." And a lot of the article is about that. It's a fairly long article. The part that I'm really interested in for us here is the root of U.S. democracy's decline. What's happening to limited but democracy in America this year and next is not an isolated development. This is not just about Trump and the 2020 election. The process of destruction of democracy in America has been underway for at least a quarter of a century. It is only now accelerating at a faster rate for all to see. And I see I've forgotten to share this. So let me share the screen for you. And you can see the article once again. There it is. The process first erupted into the open with the success of Newt Gingrich's Contract for America movement in the early 1990s, when he and his radical friends wrested control of the U.S. House of Representatives with the 1994 election. Gingrich publicly declared at the time his objective thereafter would be, quote, to create a dysfunctional government, unquote, that the public would lose faith in. Then there was the election of 2000, when Al Gore lost to George W. Bush as a result of the U.S. stopping the recounting of votes in Florida, in effect, quote, selecting, unquote, George W. Bush. Gore and the Democrats let it happen, deciding it was a one-off event, that the system would return to the political shell game in which the competing elites would trade off ruling every 4 or 8 years. Then came the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court in 2010 that declared dollars spent by corporations were a form of free speech protected by the Constitution's First Amendment. Corporations were people, had the same rights as the rest of us, even though they never died and amassed massive dollars and thus votes. 2013, that same Supreme Court gutted the 1964 Civil Rights Act, opening the door to widespread voter suppression that ensured in dozens of red state Republican legislatures that would thereafter use their entrenched control to gerrymander and ensure their control for decades to come. By the way, that happened due to the incompetence, of the Democratic Party and their inability to get very much done in 2009, in 2010, and their failure to act immediately after the Supreme Court made their CU decision in 2010. They were asleep to the possibility that they might be swept out of control of Congress and control of the Senate, and they might not be able to pass laws against that or somehow to get around it. They were asleep at the wheel, and the Republicans swept in, as you know, in the election of 2010, took over the House in 2011, and the opportunity was gone to do anything about what the Supreme Court had done. That, too, was endorsed by the Supreme Court. The Patriot Act after 2001 then sliced away long-standing protections of civil liberties and civil rights for U.S. citizens. These were measures extended annually by National Defense Authorization Acts, the NDAA, like the one that the Democrats just voted for. Not least, technology developments in the last decade have solidified control of broad segments of public opinion in favor of Trump forces and right-wing interests in general. Without the Facebooks, YouTubes, and the internet, it would not have been possible to create the 70 million adherents to Trumpism in today's U.S. body politic, or the countless conspiracy theories that serve as a kind of secular religion that ties the congregation to the interests of their clever politician priests. Naive techies promised that technology and the internet would deepen democracy in America. Time will show, as it is already, that technology has instead deepened government surveillance of the public, has assisted tighter control of public assembly and protests, and enabled the manipulation of the electoral process as never before. Technology, too, is undermining democracy in America, and the clever elites and radicals know it. All that was needed for this political conflagration was the proper fire lit under tens of millions of Americans desperate for change. The match was lit by the deep discontent across America with the direction of governance by the elites, Republican and Democrat alike. That discontent developed since the mid-1990s as well, in parallel with the rise of the radical right, with the offshoring and destruction of millions of decent paying jobs. That was NAFTA, by the way. And of course, the neoliberal takeover of government completely during the 1980s and the 1990s, the hollowing out of industrial America and the middle class, and the destruction of unions, and the replacing of good-paying jobs with low-pay, few benefits, tens of millions of part-time, temp, and gig work. And to the collapse of jobs and wages was added the privatization of healthcare, with its ever-rising costs, that denied health access for 50 million, and rising premiums, copays, and deductibles for the rest, and the destruction of the once decent pension and retirement system, and the indebting of a generation grasping at a chance at higher education to escape it all. Meanwhile, 15 trillion in tax cuts were granted to corporations, investors, and the wealthiest 1% households starting in 2001 and continuing to this day. Alongside that massive income shift and wealth shift, by the way, was the launching of never-ending wars and war spending for the next 20 years, costing at least 7 trillion more, both of which add up to about the 22 trillion in U.S. national debt as of 2019, if anybody cares. That's 23 trillion now. We know that it's not the debt that is consequential, but Jack Rasmus doesn't know that. He's not, an MMT economist or somebody who reads the MMT economists. To him, that 22 trillion in U.S. National debt is very, very significant. Then came the 2008-2009 great recession and crash. For anyone who's interested, Jack Rasmus is Tea Party. Is the Green Party, from which tens of millions of average Americans never recovered, while banks and corporations were quickly bailed out by fiscal and monetary policies that accelerated income and wealth inequalities in America several-fold. As tens of millions struggled to stay afloat during the so-called Obama recovery, corporations distributed more than $1 trillion a year, every year for the decade on average, in dividends and stock buybacks to their investors. Obama-era policies not only failed to mend this condition, but exacerbated it, thus further providing the ideological fodder for the radical right and the rise of Trump and Trump's political base. All this, too, has been part of the decline of democracy in America by providing the conditions for the evolution and deepening of anti-democratic impulses and support for radical right alternatives by wide segments of the American public. Okay. In short, the elites in general, the traditional Democrats and Republicans, have created the conditions over the past quarter century for the assault on democracy that is now intensifying throughout the U.S. Their shared fate explains why there is such intense political hatred of elites of both parties in the country on both the right and left, and in turn, why wide swaths of the public is willing to abort the remnants of democracy. Democracy hasn't been working for them. That's our democracy that hasn't been working for them. So why defend it? And they see little evidence it will change. So they throw in with clever politicians like Trump, Cruz, and others who are willing to use failing democracy as the excuse for their discontent. Get rid of the liberals, and we'll return to a former period of prosperity, also known as MAGA, i.e., the exact same claim of the Nazis in the mid-1920s. The main target of fascism in the period of its rise and support by the public is always the, quote, liberal politicians, unquote, who are responsible for the system not delivering, i.e., who are stabbing us in the back Biden and the Democrats have only 12 to 18 months to fundamentally change the conditions that are giving rise, to the attack on what little is left of U.S. democracy. However, the likely scenario is not optimistic. Should they not win, in Georgia, of course, we did have the Democrats win, in Georgia. He points to the fact that if they hadn't won, then Biden's policies and measures will still be minimalist. But he says even if the Democrats win both seats in Georgia, it's likely that Biden's policies and measures will still be minimalist and thus insufficient. He will resurrect Obama's bipartisan approach, which resulted in little basic changes then and even less now. I think that he's right about that, and we have to really fight really, really hard to change that particular outcome because Biden doesn't get it yet. Biden doesn't get it yet. Either he changes and he becomes a kind of FDR, or we get fascism again in 2022, at least the beginnings of it, and coming back full-throatedly in 2024. Biden will gain little from Senator McConnell, even with Republicans in a minority role in the Senate. And 50-50 is hardly a minority position at that. Pelosi in the House will not achieve much more with her minimal 11-vote margin either. The sliver thin margin at the recent Census 2020 will erode to a mere half dozen. With Biden championing bipartisanship with Senator McConnell, it is unlikely he'll be aggressive with executive orders and other tactics. The most likely outcome is therefore not the fundamental measures and change desperately needed in 2021 and 2022, but a minimalist go-slow approach similar to Obama's in 2009 and 2010. Obama's bipartisan approach resulted in working households waiting for 6 years to recover lost jobs, then at wages well below that of pre-2008, while investors and stockholders amassed literally trillions in dividends and stock buybacks. As Biden fails to create fundamental change, the emerging Trump, Cruz, McCarthy forces will attack him and the Democrats ever more aggressively as they move toward building a dual power situation within the red states, the governorships, and state courts. In other words, they will use the power at the state level that they have to try to delegitimize the federal power and to create a dual power situation in the United States so that as long as the national government is in control of Biden, and the Democrats, that it won't be able to do very much. It will be decapitated. The more likely scenario is the 2022 midterm elections will be a disaster for Democrats, much like 2010 was for them as well. After that, if the same cycle returns, but this time with tens of millions far worse off and with an even more radical right entrenched in Congress and a majority base in the heartland. Clearly, both wings of the corporate party of America, the Trump Republicans and Democrats, share responsibility for how we got here and even more for where we are going. Yes, the neoliberal activities over the last 40 to 45 years, they are responsible for what has happened in the United States, for the rise of Trump. If we want to stop this from happening, if we want to really respond to the fascism, really respond to Trump, it's very important, but it's not enough to throw a bunch of people out of the House and Senate and to impeach Trump and stop him from holding office in the future. That will create some relief for us yet and will be very good, but it won't be enough to stop the fascism movement in the United States. To do that, we have to turn aside what the neoliberals are doing. That brings us to our next piece, which is by Dave Sirota. And that now. That one is called "The Insurrection Was Predictable," and it's from David's blog, The Daily Poster, on January 6th. He wrote it late on January 6th, probably late that night, while things were still going on at the Capitol. He says, 2 months ago, the Daily Poster published a series of reports on the growing threat of a coup attempt, wondering why it wasn't being taken more seriously by Democrats and the media. We were scoffed at and eye-rolled as if such things could never happen in America. Nobody is scoffing or eye-rolling anymore after today's events at the U.S. Capitol. There, insurrectionists stormed the building and halted the certification of the national election, as security forces allowed them to breach the Senate chamber and shut down the proceedings. There was a notable difference in the way federal security forces met last year's Black Lives Matter protests with a show of force, and the way they allowed the Capitol to be overrun by right-wing authoritarians that they knew were coming. Okay, so about a decade ago, I wrote a book called The Uprising, unquote, quote unquote, which described how we were entering an era of chaos where right-wing groups would try to seize power. That is, the I here is Dave Sirota, not me, would try to seize power under the guise of populism. Clearly, that has been happening. We saw it speed up during the Tea Party backlash and was further accelerated by Donald Trump, who is a unique president in his willingness to use the White House megaphone to foment and destabilize. But today's events were the result of all that incitement. It was a culmination that happened inside a culture of total impunity. And we went over David's ideas on that on on Wednesday night, okay, just last night. And it is worth considering 5 points of context to understand what we're really dealing with here, because it will likely continue after Trump leaves the White House. We have long known that the far right, and specifically many Trump supporters, are hostile to democracy. 2019 polling data from Monmouth University found about a third of the strongest supporters of Trump scored in the highest ratings for authoritarian tendencies. In all, Democracy Fund data showed that roughly a third of Americans, quote, say that an authoritarian alternative to democracy would be favorable, unquote. If that projects to the voting population, we're talking about a third of the voting population being favorable to an authoritarian alternative to democracy. That's what was on display today. 2, while Trump has tried to blame violence on the left, his administration has been trying to downplay the threat of right-wing authoritarianism and white supremacy. In a whistleblower complaint, a former top Homeland Security official alleged that Trump officials ordered him to modify an agency report section on, quote, on white supremacy in a manner that made the threat appear less severe, unquote. Also, Politico reported earlier this year that Homeland Security officials have waged a years-long internal struggle to get the White House to pay attention to the threat of violent domestic extremists. But they gave up because Trump wasn't interested. Instead, federal security forces were focusing on deporting immigrants and investigating environmental activists. 3, the Capitol Police have a $460 million budget and 2,300 personnel to guard the U.S. Capitol complex. Where were they yesterday? For comparison, that is twice the size of the budget of my own city's police department, which is used to secure an entire metropolis of Denver. Okay. That's where David Sirota is, in the metropolitan area of Denver, Colorado. Somehow, this army of Capitol security forces was unable or unwilling to stop insurrectionists from breaching the building and taking over the floor of the U.S. Senate. And it's not like they were caught by surprise. They had advance warning of the potential for unrest. So it's almost as if they weren't trying to stop the mayhem. Washington Mayor Bowser's request to send National Guard reinforcements to the Capitol was initially rejected by the Defense Department, the same department whose leadership was recently purged and then replaced by loyalists of Donald Trump. That doesn't seem like a coincidence, considering Trump initially refused to call for the insurrectionists to disperse. 5. The insurrection clearly fed off months of misinformation by the Republican Party officials, who continued to push the lie that the national election was plagued by fraud. Those lies spread. A survey last month found that 3/4 of Republican voters believe the election was fraudulent, even though nobody has produced evidence of systemic fraud. Republican lawmakers in Washington continue to fuel the conspiracy theories, ultimately pressing Congress to overturn the national election. One photo caught Senator Hawley raising a fist to the oncoming insurrectionists as he headed to the Capitol to try to halt the certification of the election. There's the picture of Josh Hawley raising his fist. From Francis Chung, Senator Josh McCauley greeting protesters in the east side of the Capitol before the riots began. The leader of the riots, Josh Hawley? No, Donald Trump. As I wrote earlier this week, the Republican Party officials who fueled and abetted this insurrection did so because they assume they will feel no political, social, or legal consequences for their behavior. On the contrary, they will likely be rewarded with higher approval ratings and support for many Republican voters. And if the look forward, not backward crowd gets its way and makes sure there are no legal consequences for any of Trump's many crimes, then these Republicans will know they have a lifetime get out of jail free card for their own extremist behavior. After all of this, if nothing changes, and I tend to agree with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's aide, Dan Riffle, who today said that, quote, it always, even in moments like this, can get worse. If recent history is any guide, it almost certainly will. But things can still change, and they must. In quote, the uprising, unquote, I argued the best way to counter the rise of right-wing populism and to prevent it from spreading is for an opposition movement and party to not just issue vague paeans to democracy and the soul of the nation. The opposition must also deliver tangible material gains for working people rather than continuing to be an elite and effete caretaker of a let-them-eat-cake establishment that right-wing provocateurs can forever burn in effigy. The New Deal, delivering such gains to the working class, helped tamp down the outbreak of right-wing fascism in America. This was during the 1930s. Nearly a century later, the Georgia elections this week proved the same point. There, 2 right-wing Republican authoritarians were defeated by the black Reverend who runs Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, and by a Jewish guy, and the Democratic duo won by relentlessly campaigning on a simple promise to deliver $2,000 checks to millions of people in their state facing eviction, starvation, and bankruptcy. Of course, no matter what the Democrats might actually deliver, survival checks, survival checks, a higher minimum wage, guaranteed medical care, massive investments in job creation, a crackdown on abusive corporations, etc. There will always be a right-wing authoritarian movement in America willing to weaponize racism, and illiberalism for its cause. So it's not simple. There is not a straightforward one-to-one relationship between enacting policies that improves people's lives and instantly snuffing out the kind of fascism that reared its head at the Capitol today, but delivering for millions of people who've been economically pulverized for generations is the best and probably only way to try to halt fascism's wider spread to more of the general population over the long haul. That work must begin now, not tomorrow, not in a few months, right now. And of course, I completely agree with David on this. It should by now, almost on the point of beginning, because we should be seeing the coming inauguration of Bernie Sanders as President of the United States would certainly have begun to bring the delivery for millions of people that would have been able to roll back the fascists. But instead, of course, we have Joe Biden. That we must do everything we can to make Joe Biden rise to the occasion, to see to it that he does, because the only way to roll back the rise of fascism now is to get people busy. It's to deliver the jobs within the Green New Deal, including its job guarantee program, but also the transition to the Green New Deal with a transition that's just for everybody, including Medicare for all, including the living wage from a Green New Deal that would revitalize the rural areas in America. A lot of people in Trump's movement come from the rural areas of America where the economy is absolutely dead and there's very little to do. People there need jobs, and they need jobs at a living wage, a true living wage. Not just $15 an hour anymore. $15 an hour might have been a battle cry back in 2012. It's now 2020. We need, maybe for the lowest cost area in the United States, $15 an hour is a living wage right now. But we need cost of living adjustments above that for every other area of the United States more expensive than that. So that if you live in New York, or if you live in Alaska, or if you live in Los Angeles, that minimum wage might be as high as $26, $28, even $30 an hour. It has to be, because people have to live, or they will look for other answers. They will look for other people that are offering them a way to live. So the people who want to have democracy, who want things to be democratic, who want a rule of law, who want a society that is not cruel, who want a society that supports people and that enables people to achieve their full potential. That kind of society has to deliver the goods for people with a government that legislates in their interests, not in the interests of the donors. So David is briefly outlining, and Jack Rasmus, by implication, was suggesting turning around the neoliberal past and creating and implementing the kind of agenda that was put forward by the Sanders campaign. Did you see that agenda on his website during the campaign? It would have been transformative for America. It would have changed everything. The job guarantee itself, in the context of the Green New Deal, would have changed the character of work for millions of Americans and tightened the labor market in such a way that everybody could have had kinder treatment from the private sector. It would have been necessary because there would have been a shortage of workers. So employers would have had to treat people differently. Unions would have grown again and would have been in a position to protect workers and to help them and to create once more an infrastructure to protect them, whose benefits would have spilled over to the non-unionized part of the population, as was once the condition here in the United States during the 1960s and part of the 1970s. We had it before. We can have it again. But we have to turn away from neoliberalism. And we have to do whatever we have to do to make these parties turn aside from their suicidal course. Because if they don't do it, we will have fascism to reckon with again in 2022, okay, 2024. But it's not just the substantive policies that have to change. What also has to change in order to get the substantive policies to change, so we have to change at the same time the oligarchy in the Congress, to break down Congress's tendency to always look after the donors and not look after us. We have to give more power to the backbenchers in Congress, through whom the money from the donors doesn't flow as well, and who therefore have some independence from the donors. We have to make them more powerful so they can propose that part of the agenda that we need for ourselves and for the rest of the population of the United States. Now, outside of these things, outside of the diminution of the oligarchy in the Congress, we also need a diminution of the oligarchy in the country and in the political system more generally. We need to have the end of oligarchy in the political parties. We need to have the end of oligarchy in the interest groups. We need to have the end of oligarchy in the economic world. How do we get that to happen? We have to add one more element. And I don't have time today to go into this in terms of an article. I meant to cover it today, but there was too much reaction to cover. So I haven't finished my story yet. In a sense, okay, today was part 2 of fascism, insurrection, and democracy, even though I called it something else. But I never got to the end of part 2. So on Saturday, I'm going to get to the end of part 2. And what part 2 is called it's called a meta layer for restoring democracy, okay, and open society. This is requirements for an information technology platform that will not undermine democracy, but that will create democracy again and develop a counter to the oligarchies that pervade our society. So that's going to be primarily what I'm going to do on the upcoming in-depth show on Saturday night. So now I will stop sharing this and I will return to your comments and consider them. Still 10 of you here. Thank you very much. I see Catherine Tokarska is here. Thank you very much, Catherine, for becoming a patron. That was very, very nice of you. Kay says, listening to Movement for a People's Party 2. Kay says, shared. Also, Dolores says, Facebook is censoring without putting people in jail. That's been my experience. Yes, I know. Carmen says, yeah, man, the Kraken sucked. Carmen says, sounds sexy. Kevin St. Ford says, hey, Joe. Hey, Kevin. Okay, it was nice to see you today. Oh, and by the way, I noticed you come from Brooklyn, or if you don't come from Brooklyn, that you live there now. Okay, but either way, I come from the Bronx, so hi. Okay, and Lana Dell, 8 the clock, says, hi, Kevin. Carmen Mina says, or any disaster movie scene with a jingo message. Bonnie says, hi to everyone. Sandy says, hello, shared. Hi, Sandy. How you doing? And Carmen says, hi, Bonnie. Sandy says, hi, Bonnie, Kay, Carmen, Dolores, and Joe. Kay says, hi, Sandy. Carmen says, hi, Sandy. Nice that you made it. Sandy says, thanks, Carmen. Carmen says, always a pleasure. Carmen says, nope, they're just worried about corporate pulling out. Sandy says, they were just lucky this didn't turn into a bloodbath. They were. They were. Carmen says, that's because they were mostly white and Capitol Police were complicit. Sandy said, the whole thing is odd. Kay said, some had guns too. Carmen says, how about the seditionists? I'm still in Congress. Cori Bush is trying to take care of them with a resolution. Okay, and Anthony smiles. Kay says, Cori Bush is trying to get them expelled, Kay says. Yes. Barbara Warnick says, traitors, I'm so with you. And Bonnie's about to sit down here and join me and ask me if I would like to have some Gatorade. Okay, I would really, but if you can get rid of this water for me, that would be wonderful. Then I can have some Gatorade. Thanks, honey. So Barbara says, traitors, I'm so with you. And Carmen says, Harley's book got put on ice by Simon & Schuster over this. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Great. That's great. Lana says, hi, Anthony. Sandy says, I wonder if Trump set out to destroy the Republican Party. He once said on Oprah they were stupid, but years ago when he had written his book. Well, he probably set out to either take over the Republican Party or destroy it. And he may yet turn out to be successful. Okay, in the sense that if Dave Dayen's suggestion is taken, then most of the Republicans who still favor democracy may depart from the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party, essentially leaving the rest of the Republican Party as a rump party that's been totally taken over by the Trumpists. So we'll have a three-party system: the Trumpists, the corporatists, and the progressives. I don't know how that's going to work out. And Sandy says, hi, Steve. Kay says, hi, Steve. Steve says, hi, Sandy and Kay. And Steve says, my head is still spinning from yesterday. 5 dead now. Thanks, honey.
You're welcome.
Carmen says, 25th Amendment was already blocked by the 140 Republicans. How can the 140 Republicans block the 25th Amendment? I mean, it has to go through the cabinet first. It hasn't gone through the cabinet. Barbara says, put that on the floor for those complicit. Sandy says, if Pence voted for the 25, but would it be pushed through? I don't think so. Okay, but anyway, it requires a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. So why is it not better just to impeach Trump tomorrow and have him face a trial in the Senate? It only requires a majority vote in the House to impeach him. It doesn't have to be a 2/3 vote in the House. So rather than having a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, which would be impossible to get, most likely, have a majority vote in the House, have it be a regular impeachment with all that implies, and see if the Republicans in the Senate will join with enough Democrats in order to create a 2/3 vote there. It would take 17 of the Republican senators out of the 50 Republican senators to join. There might be 17 Republican senators. Carmen Muniz says, then they tried to name it, to blame it on Antifa. But the NSA exposed them by saying, no, they weren't. True story. Kay says, I doubt it. Sandy dead. Carmen says, blame it. Correction. I caught that. Barbara says, you might be surprised. Carmen says, that was extortion. Well, the rest of the administration doesn't want it either. Sandy says, Trump better get himself a better lawyer than Rudy Tooty. Steve Wolfbrand says, Seth Rich leaked to WikiLeaks. No Russians involved. That may very well be the case. Harmon says, yet another COVID variant now in South Africa. Stay protected. Oh, my God. He says, I don't know about any lizard people, but there's a lot, of pedos in powerful places. Steve says, I know as many people who've had COVID as not. It's thick out here. God. Carmen says, by throwing out the QAnon bull SH asterisk T to see who'll be dumb enough to bite. I see, especially the alien part. Kay says, I might need to get out. I might need to get out of there, Steve. Kevin says, hi, Lana. And Steve says, yeah, maybe I'm an essential worker. Kay says, can you transfer? Steve says, BRB, I can retire. Sandy said, you should register to get the vaccine. Sandy says, that's what I just did. I retired. Oh, congratulations, Sandy. Steve says, ASAP. Catherine Tokarska says, had an argument today with a Trump supporter about being Antifa, and I was told I should stop listening to fake media. Yep. That's what they're going to say. They live in a reality world, of their own, except it's not a reality world. It's a perceived reality world. Catherine says, Trump media rules. Well, it rules among them anyway. Kay says, but laugh out loud, that's what they all say. Carmen says, that's their deflection to everything. Carmen says, what a powerful article. Now, which one was that? I thought I had a few powerful articles tonight. Catherine took, probably the William Rivers Pitt article. Catherine Tokarska says, there is something to that, though, guys. They had to hide under desks. Good for them to sense fear for a few minutes. Probably. Steve says, I found that part amusing, Catherine. Carmen says, do you really think they have enough sense to feel fear? I think they were just playing hide and go seek. Catherine says, also, some of the guards taking selfies and opening doors. Violence respects violence, Sandy says. We used to do lockdown drills. They are unnerving. I can't imagine the real thing. Carmen says, how I'd love to see Cruz expelled. Yeah, me too. Catherine says, Carmen Muniz seemed like at least some of the people in the photos look concerned, probably not the most deserving ones. Catherine says, he's a disgusting man in every way. When I look at him, I feel dirty. Carmen says, if they resign, they get to keep the benefits. Catherine Tokarska says, Cruz, I mean. Same. Yeah, that's an incentive to resign because you get to keep your benefits. Evelina says, him and Rubio. Carmen says, Gates gives off the same vibe, Catherine. So does Cotton. Catherine Tokarska, I'm torn about my feelings about these protests. I mean, we need protests to Medicare for all, cancel student loans, increasing Social Security benefits, so many needs in the community. We complain these crazy guys actually pushed inside the belly of the beast, even if it was just stupid worship, okay, the orange one. Well, yeah, but to protest, there's no reason why you have to go in and take over the congressional buildings. If you got 1 million people outside chanting, believe me, they're going to know there are 1 million people outside. They're going to know that. The point is going to be made. If you have 10 million people flocking into Washington completely peacefully and standing outside, and nothing but passive resistance, you're going to make your point. There's no need to run inside with 3,000 people or a couple of thousand people or 1,000 people. I mean, that's simply physical coercion. That's not what you should be doing. So Kay says, hi, Evelina. Evelina says, hey, Kay. If you surround the Congress with 10 million people, don't worry, they'll be afraid enough. Catherine Tokarska said, I told that Trump supporter that I didn't think these people reflected all of Trump voters any more than the looters reflected all the BLM protesters. And I think that's a fair point, Catherine. Sandy Degg said, hi, Evelina. Evelina says, hi, Sandy. Carmen said, it was Tito's Nuremberg rallies that fed the coup. His weren't as big as the Nuremberg rallies. Steve says, DeVos is out. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Ding dong. Sandy Degg says, woohoo. Sandy says, when people get desperate, they will go into the streets, and that could get really ugly. Could. Carmen says, the common thread among the seditionists yesterday was our house, meaning the White House, image, if they knew that their federal taxes don't fund anything. And Carmen says, especially during COVID, Steve says, anyone know how Steve Grumbine, is doing? Carmen says he finally got some sleep. They were posting GFM, GoFundMe accounts for him earlier today. Yes, they were. Evelina says, good point. There is deep discontent on both the left and the right and hate of elites. Catherine Tokarska says, what comes next after Trump can be so much worse? Evelina says, making it a volatile situation. Carmen says, well, Biden again said he's open to the $2,000 survival checks. If it's for every month isn't clear, I could probably tell you he's not open for $2,000 on every month. He'll have to be convinced for that. I personally hope he gets convinced, by Rashida and by the Automatic Boost to Communities Act, because it would be so important to have the $1 trillion coin being the trigger for federal reserves to be added to the Treasury spending account. Well, hopefully the elite learned something yesterday. Usually they learn the wrong lessons, Sandy. They're always learning the wrong lessons. They also always tend to learn, okay, the lesson of doubling down on coercion when they deal with people who are not a part, okay, of the elite. That's the trouble
What is
with violence. Huh?
What has Trump done for these people?
What has Trump done for these people? Well, he's made them feel like somebody's in their corner. I don't know what he materially did for them. One thing he did for them is he improved the NAFTA situation a little, marginally. I don't think they felt very much about that. I think as part of the earlier tax cuts, 85% of them went to the rich, but there were 15% that went to everybody else, so maybe that helped a little for some people. Okay, the other things that he did for them is he was cruel to people they didn't like. He gave them the feeling that he was handling the immigration problem and that the immigrants maybe would not be taking over the United States, taking over their jobs. They had severe fears, the immigrants, were going to displace the brown and the tan immigrants. Okay, we're going to displace all of the poor white people in the United States. I know that's been going on for years, but that's what a lot of people think that he did for them. I mean, I don't. Also, people give him credit for the CARES Act. Strangely, they give him credit for the CARES Act.
No.
It was a big thing for many people to have his signature on the checks. He got the desired response from that.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. It's really, really strange. People have their reality totally bent out of shape. They also like how he packed the federal courts and in that way protected them against socialism. By filling the courts up with the neoliberals who will continue to make rulings that allow the corporations to screw them.
Yes.
And they won't see the connection.
Yes.
So they will be further screwed, and they will need to have the protection of the socialists they fear, but they'll never turn to them because they're socialists.
Well, does that mean we have to take Social Security away from them?
I sure hope not. Kay says, the more money they have, the worse they are, in my opinion. Yes, I know. The more money they have, the crueler they seem to be. Evelina Pont says, I don't know, Sandy, they don't learn. Carmen says, corporations are pulling out some support, so a few will. And Independent Left News says, number one in headline today. What's that, Carmen Muniz? Is it general strike? Oh, Independent Left says it was the Sirota story. Our minds seem to run the same way, Indy Left. Evelina says, Carmen Muniz support for whom, Trump? Evelina says, not enough. They are the elites. Carmen says, Evelina Pont, I have to go back to my page for the article. I forget their names, but it was the Republicans involved in the coup. Yeah, there's an article in Common Dreams that lists all the Republicans in the Congress who are supportive of the coup. Evelina says, Carmen Muniz, I suppose it's something, but after the fact. Carmen says, Capitol Police turned down offered help by Pentagon, okay, and National Guard, but they turned it down. Evelina says, I read the National Guard did not respond, okay, to the request. Evelina says, I'm assuming there will be an investigation. Okay, says, there needs to be, Evelina, And Carmen says, Johannes Asifa Halamariam says, that quote, that should wait until Trump leaves office before charging any of them. Otherwise, he will pardon them. Unquote. Now, not if he's impeached at the same time. Evelina says 5 people died. 5 people. Oh, I had heard that 4 people died. And Catherine says, as far as BKs go, so far, very quiet.
Sounds like death follows him.
Yeah, the Trump cult is a death cult. It is. It is a death cult. I think people are in stock. I'm laying low. In stock? I'm laying low. Catherine, I'm not sure what that means. Kay says, Sirota has been on many programs lately. Yeah, he's very popular with Rising. Very popular with Rising. Well, he's great. He's a very good writer. He was Bernie Sanders' speechwriter this last time around. He's really excellent, okay, as a journalist. Carmen says, but Davos resigned and then corrects it to Davos. Yeah, she figured it was time to go. Maybe she knows something. I mean, maybe Trump's next attempt will involve her brother, Eric Prince, and his private army. Sandy Deck says, there is a God. Laugh out loud. Kay says, better late than never, I guess. Carmen Muniz. Evelina says, with Biden, donors and corporate elites will not suddenly disappear. Even if Biden took some steps in the right direction, he'd have to deal with them. I don't think much will substantially change. Kay says, sadly, I fear you are right, Evelina. Indy Left says, I'm still here, Joe. Okay, Indy Left says, hi, Bonnie, hydrate Joe.
Hi.
Okay, Anthony Anthony offers what appears to be a clover leaf. Oh, boy. And Carmen says, Jack Morse on Mashable. Trump's back on Twitter telling his supporters, you do not represent our country? Oh, my. Steve Cecil says, do you think it was the Israelis' final taking number 2 intelligence position in the world? Huh? I'm not sure the context, Steve, of that particular remark. Stephen Cecil, that is. Tell me something about the context, then I'll try to answer your question. Catherine Tokarska says, well, taking over the building certainly gets their attention. We had some 1 million signatures to cancel student loans are delivered in boxes to Obama, got nothing. No, that's true. And Carmen says, Q Shaman sounds like he was the ringleader. Bubba is going to love him with his furry buffalo horned headdress. I saw that headdress. That was really something different. Carmen says, Trump withdraws nominating Chad Wolf for DHS. Sky Palmer wrote, Ted Cruz and Hawkey, I think it's Hawley, are so toxic that business leaders may cut off political donations, report Raw Story source. Kay says Trump's followers are not too smart and don't look ahead of their own noses. Catherine says socialism and drive-in abortions. Yeah, drive-in abortions, they hate those. Paid for by the hard-earned tax dollars for your irresponsible choices. Carmen says, One of the Capitol cops must have died. He was on life support. Oh my God. Kay says he did die. Oh my God. The fifth person was the police officer who got a bad beating from a mob. Oh boy. Oh boy. I guess the Capitol Police made a mistake letting those people in, didn't they? One of their own got it, paid the price. And Carmen says DeVos's brother probably paid off the Capitol Police. It's possible. He's got plenty of money. Catherine Tokarska they say the police officer death is bad reporting. That was on abc27.com. Carmen Muniz and promised them a job with his private security forces. Wow. Kay says Obama was a waste. Yes, I have to agree. The whole Obama affair was worse than a waste because it put us another 10 years down the road without any real change to the neoliberal, inverted, totalitarian system which we've been living under. The one that pretends to be a democracy but does nothing for the people at all. Never does anything for the people. Okay, folks, I've run through your comments. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for sharing. I will see you on Saturday when I will get to the next thing we need to do to build a real democracy. That involves solving the problem of the iron law, of oligarchy. I'm going to talk about that on Saturday.
Thank you for donations.
Oh, thank you for any donations, by the way, that you can give. Thank you also for any donations to Steve Grumbine, because he obviously is in a bad way and he doesn't have insurance. So, of course, if you can afford anything, he certainly needs some help, in his GoFundMe. So Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. I love you all, and we love you, Kay, too. Sandy Day says, thank you, Joe, Bonnie, and everyone. Thank you for coming, Sandy. Also, Sandy, but could you send me your email address, please? I think I had that at one point, but I seem to have somehow misplaced it. It's not in the usual places I look for email addresses. So please leave your email address, in a Facebook message to me. Thank you. Carmen Muniz says, it was a pleasure. Sleep well, everyone, if possible. Catherine Tokarska says, oh, crap, no insurance. Yeah, no insurance. He was working as a contractor doing it was probably federal work or state work that he was working on, but the contractors often don't have insurance. These, Beltway bandit types of companies, they don't give insurance. And so it's up to the individual to provide the insurance. But if someone is pressed, like Steve is, needing a lot of funds, for an autistic child, support, of an autistic child, and other kinds of support that he has to provide as well, he may not have been, in a position to spend what insurance would have cost for him on the exchanges. It would be a very high price per month, as I think you all know, and probably would not actually provide very much coverage for him for this kind of very, very serious illness. And by the way, what happened to the promise that the COVID treatment wasn't going to cost people anything. Seems to me that was a promise I heard early this year from the Trump administration. Another promise unkept. And Lana says, good night. Thank you, Lana, for being here. Catherine says, good night, all. Sandy says, okay. Thanks, Sandy. Carmen says, honey, you are my shining star. Don't you go away. Lana says, also, no paid sick leave. Steve G. Yeah, no paid sick leave. I think that's of course, we need paid sick leave for everybody in the United States. But yes, no paid sick leave for contractors either. So that's a terrible thing. So good night, everybody. Stay safe. Hopefully, I'll see you on Saturday night. Good night.